What is up? Welcome to the episode. Today we're talking with Sally Norton, and last week's episode was a little bit of a precursor to this week's episode, but by no means do you need to listen to episode 171 in order to understand this stuff. However, I shared a little bit of my story in regards to oxalate, so it might provide some context for you guys if you'd like to listen to that either before or after you listen to this one. But let's dig right in. So Sally, what are oxalates and how did they even get on your radar to begin with?
Yeah, so oxalates are something that shows up in our plant foods. Plants make oxalic acid and oxalate crystals in the different shapes and forms and ionic, so we call them oxalates. And we're eating them from plant foods. A certain subset of plant foods have a lot of it, and if you overeat it, it ends up being very poisonous to the body and create big problems. And when I was at Cornell University getting my nutrition degree, it was like 2 sentences in the textbooks here and there, like, oh, it could bind calcium and lower how much calcium if you have high oxalate foods like tea and potatoes and sweet potatoes and spinach. So you lower the calcium value of the meal if you include those. So there's one sentence and with like 6 foods listed. And then there's this, oh yeah, and this is related to kidney stones. Who cares? End of sentence, end of discussion. So it's actually, and the oxalate thing is very interesting. It's a cleaning chemical too. It's such a strong grabber of minerals. We use it in cleaners like Zud cleaner as a wood bleach and barkeeper's friend, and it's been used in industry for lots of different, it helps engravers etch things because it can take away, surface and melt down kind of the metals on the surface, and you can polish rock and you can do photographic printing and you can bleach fabric and wood. And it's been used in industry since the late 1700s. If you eat too much of something that bleaches fabric and wood and steals all your calcium, you can get in big trouble with your health. But that's not what it said in the textbooks.
About a year ago, oxalates came on my radar because I was experiencing these urinary tract-like issues. I was going for testing. Everything was coming back negative. I felt bloated. I'd never experienced any of this before. And the reason this popped up was because I was eating a lot of white rice and I digest white rice quite well, but I decided for some reason to switch the carbohydrate that I was eating from white rice to yams and sweet potatoes. And I started eating a ridiculous amount of yams and sweet potatoes. I also had a little bit of chocolate in my diet, dark chocolate. But then I started experiencing these UTI-like symptoms, and I'm thinking, it can't be the sweet potato. Sweet potato is such a healthful food, it's got, all this good stuff in it. And
it tastes great.
And it tastes amazing. I was doing sweet potato fries, like salts on them. They were delish, right? And then I cut the sweet potato out and started, consuming more of your work and being aware of oxalate, chocolate, all sorts of different things that you wouldn't necessarily think contain this chemical, because there's no real rhyme or reason to it with some of the things, like you wouldn't think. But anyways, I'm just so grateful to you and your work for figuring this out, because fortunately now it's something that I have under control.
Yeah, and you caught it early. I have clients and associates who have struggled with urinary tract issues and irritable bladder for decades and decades and decades, to the point where it's waking them up all night long, and they have this chronic pain and heaviness and this weighing them down and exhausting them to the point where their brain isn't working anymore and they're getting depressed and they get suicidal. When you don't sleep well because your bladder is waking you up all night long, it gets really bad. And you caught it within a year, which I consider a great success. And evidence that my efforts to get the information out is actually getting out there enough that you can find it now online. So now modern times, we have the internet. And when this problem, that's my hope too, is that more people who end up in trouble can go, oh, there's something to do with my diet. Because a lot of times, why would you associate sweet potato eating with bladder problems? Nobody's got any awareness of that.
Nobody's connecting those dots. And I do this for a living and I wasn't connecting those dots. So I can't imagine what a lay population person is, they can't be expected to figure that out. Now, what are some of the most common foods with a whole bunch of oxalate in it that we consume on a daily basis? Because many of them are quote unquote health foods.
Yeah, well, on the non-health food side, there's peanut butter and potatoes. So the baking potatoes, not the new potatoes, but the russet style potato that we use to make potato chips and French fries. Now, when you go out to lunch, it's a bag of chips or fries in most meals. And when you go out to dinner, would you like baked or fries with that? You know, at lunch, would you like chips or fries? At dinner, would you like fries or baked with like potatoes? And then you go to school and you get tater tots. And then there's like the Super Bowl and you get to have chips again. And so chips are a big one. French fries are a big one, and peanut butter. These are things we grow up on. And then if you love tea, like after high school, I'd come home from a high school day and I'd make a big pint of instant tea to watch a soap opera with and do that every day. You know, like little things like that can start adding up. And then if you try to get healthy, you want to stay thin or fit or whatever, you're going to add into spinach salads. Spinach is uber high. And then now the last 20 years, it's been all about green juicing and smoothies. And that's often using spinach, is really high. So spinach has become this sort of darling vegetable that is known to be toxic, known to be a problem for 100 years of research. Spinach isn't good. And yet we think it is. So that's really popular now. Sweet potatoes are really popular. That's exactly how I ruined my health. I went from being vegan and couldn't eat wheat, bread, and beans anymore to using sweet potatoes as my daily starch and love them. And right away, I didn't connect it, but right away I started getting these little fine lines that you see on someone who's old around my eyes. I was like 35 or 6 at the time. And I started getting more knots in my shoulders. I mean, vegan was bad enough. But at night, I would get these like knife blades in my rhomboids. And I go like, oh man, I can hardly sleep. Would somebody please, you know, like, so I was getting these little things, but I didn't know any connection between pain, muscle knots, wrinkles, jumpy bladder, and sweet potatoes. So sweet potato is another popular one. Let's see, blackberries, kiwi, rhubarb, beets, beet greens, Swiss chard, chocolate, almonds, cashews, chia. These are all like superfoody things. People are doing chia bowls and things that I never did in history. And so you're in a position now with those high oxalate foods becoming really popular. You could get into big trouble, literally poisoning yourself. You can only eat so much barkeeper's friend cleaner and get away with it.
Now, you explained some muscle knots and things like that you experience. How can folks think about how that works? Because they think about a muscle knot when they like move in a certain way or go to the gym and tweak something. Like, how does that work for the folks at home listening?
Yeah. So I love talking mechanisms, thinking about them. Like, how could this be? Because I'm like that. That's why I've spent 8 years reading the medical literature, because I'm like, the results aren't even good enough for me. Like the fact that this brought me back to life and I'm no longer on the couch and I'm able to work again because I figured this out for myself. Like, but why? How? What? And so I understand the mechanism. So if you're a chelating molecule, that means you grab minerals easily. You like to grab calcium, iron, magnesium. You waste potassium, you use up sodium. So sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, these ions are electrolyte ions that are used in the body for lots of things, but particularly for informational purposes in cells and also for electric charges. So cells work, especially muscle cells and nerve cells, especially rely on this, but all life depends on this kind of battery differential, where on one side of the membrane you have a positive charge and the other side you have a negative charge. So that differential gives you this electromagnetic power to create energy and to make things happen. So we have to have careful control over calcium ions in cells, super careful control. The calcium ion is the universal messaging signal, and it's also an energy signal. And so muscles and nerves rely on calcium ions and other ions in order to function. Well, when you have oxalate around, mucking around with where the ions are, how many are available, by grabbing calcium and other ions, you mess all that up. Like cells have to control calcium. Nerves, if they can't control their calcium, if muscles can't control their calcium, they get stuck in spasticity. We see it in like heart arrhythmias, because the first place the oxalate will take the calcium from is your bloodstream. And the amount of ions, especially calcium ions in your blood, affects the pacemaker, which controls the rate and the ability of the heart to pulse properly, to beat properly. So you start seeing arrhythmias or muscle knots, you start seeing spasms, you can get problems with the motility in the digestive tract, which depends on nerves and muscles. You can get spasms or things like hiccups in the diaphragm. Hiccups are a sign of oxalate poisoning, actually. The sign that tends to happen near the end in a rat study using starfruit, which is very high in oxalate. Starfruit juice to rats, they end up getting hiccups and then they die. It's same with the human cases. One of the final one of the
Stages.
pre-death signs that you're going to die is a hiccup, because a hiccup is saying your ions are so messed up that the diaphragm and the nerves that control the diaphragm, the vagal nerve and others, are not getting, they're losing control over their ions. So they're losing control over their function. And so that obviously the hiccup is quite serious. The heart sits on the diaphragm. Right. So the vagus nerve, the heart, and the diaphragm, they're all very closely related right there in the chest. And all of that is right close to the liver. So when you eat oxalate foods like the sweet potatoes, you absorb the oxalic acid ions. They go right between the cells and they go into the liver. And the liver doesn't do anything about it. It doesn't detox this poison. It actually makes additional oxalate as part of its metabolism, just a little bit. And so all that oxalate you eat floods the liver, stresses it out, but then just 2 inches away is the heart. Like from the liver, it goes up into the heart. It has to go through the diaphragm to the heart. So right away after meals, well, it's about a 4-hour lag time of the absorption process is really a 10 or 20-hour process. And so at around 4 hours, you start to get this peak of a lot of it coming into the bloodstream. And so 4 hours after your meal is you might start to have funny things like funny feelings in the chest or heart, or me, I would have nighttime hiccup attacks. And I was surprised to learn by reading the literature that a hiccup is a sign of neurotoxicity. Okay. That means your nerves are being damaged and aren't functioning properly. And when the nerves don't function properly, your muscles don't function properly because the motor neurons tell the muscles what to do. So you get all kinds of muscle related symptoms that seem unrelated, but it's that same fundamental problem where the calcium ions have been disturbed. The cell's ability to control them is being interfered with by the oxalate.
That is fascinating to think about it that way, as far as a hiccup being basically a diaphragm spasm, like just like a different muscle would spasm. Sometimes people, get spasms under their eyes or like wherever it is.
Twitching.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That
another sign of neurotoxicity, like twitching. And yeah. So even things like chronic constipation or IBS could be a sign of gut toxicity, because the nerves and the muscles and all the systems that help coordinate all that are being mucked with.
Now, you mentioned that the first place that the body takes oxalate from is the blood, which makes sense because it's probably the most calcium, deleterious there. Or sorry, the calcium. Yeah. So where does what does it do after that? Where does it put it? Where does it go? How should people think about that process?
Yeah, I wish science would really think harder about this and do more studies on it, because the assumption is that you eat oxalate and it goes straight to the bladder and you pee it out. And that's why you get some of the early symptoms are often bladder and pelvic related, because the kidneys are the main 90% or better of the oxalate that gets out of your gut and into your blood ends up in your urine, because it's the kidney's job to clear it out. So in science, we pretend that the sweet potato goes from your mouth to your bladder, and we don't think about what happens in the middle very much. But it's really obvious from the research that exists that the body holds on to the excess oxalate to try to prevent it from overwhelming the blood, the heart, and the kidneys. Because the rest of the body knows if the heart ain't happy, ain't nobody happy.
Mm-hmm.
And if the kidneys aren't working, we're all doomed, right? The body's smarter than humans are. The body goes, well, we'll
Absolutely.
sacrifice some muscles and bones. We got all this other places we can stash it. The immune system comes along, the endothelium and the endothelial cells and so on start acting on our behalf and protecting us and restoring the blood's calcium. It sometimes takes a lag time of half an hour to 2 hours for the body to put back the calcium into the blood. So people will have low calcium attacks where they're sure they're having a heart attack or something. They get really high pulse rates sometimes, or hypertension at the same time, off the charts. They go to the emergency room, and by the time the doctor sees them, or by the time they've driven there and gotten checked in, the body's correcting the calcium problems. And then by the time somebody hooks them up to tests, there's a long lag time. I mean, you don't walk in the door and you're immediately hooked to a test. No. It's usually like an hour. And by then you're normal and they send you home. What are you worrying about? You nut job. There's nothing wrong with you. Because the body doesn't leave you in a state of distress. It's going to correct it. But to do that, it has to be able to generate bicarbonate. It has to generate calcium and more minerals and get that all straight. Where's it going to get all that extra calcium from? Well, the bones, right? Our main mineral reservoir is the bones. So you start using up the bones after every high oxalate meal, like big piles of sweet potato. And eventually you let that go on too long, you'll end up with osteopenia. And you'll wonder, why would a weight trainer or someone who's physically active like I am have osteopenia?
Yeah. And I am, again, so grateful that I caught this sooner rather than later because of the way that my diet has progressed. So I used to drink milk like it was going out of style when I was really young and eat a lot of yogurt and all that sort of stuff. I then stopped because it was flaring up my skin. And I stopped for years. And then I implemented all of this sweet potato back into my diet and I started to experience the UTI-like symptoms. I then lowered my oxalate consumption, have since reintroduced dairy, and I'm tolerating it perfectly. I digest it well. It doesn't flare up my skin. And now I'm eating yogurt, Greek yogurt on a daily basis. And it's like my favorite food. What is going on there? Like, what is going on with the skin and all that? Like, this is fascinating to me.
It is fascinating. And I see this all the time that we get to the point of eating too much oxalate because we're avoiding milk and wheat. And then you stop the oxalate and the milk and wheat are fine.
Mm-hmm.
The oxalate the acid is bad news for all cells, even the cells in your gut. And remember, your gut is just a single layer of cells that have to do lots of things. I mean, it's a whole variety of cells, but many of them are absorptive cells trying to hang on to minerals, bring them in and other nutrients and nutrients and protect you from toxins. Well, acid and crystals. So the other thing, the plants make oxalate as calcium oxalate crystals in these very specific shapes. Plants deliberately need to store both calcium and oxalate in the form of calcium oxalate crystals. And it's a fairly easy project for them to do. Plants design these scaffoldings made of amino acids or proteins. And those proteins have a lot of affinity for calcium. And so calcium oxalate, naturally, the plants make oxalic acid, often by first making vitamin C. That turns into very easily degenerates into oxalate or oxalic acid. So it's not a lot of work for the plants to make oxalate, oxalic acid. There's lots of calcium in soils. Plants have overabundant supply of calcium. So they easily make calcium oxalate crystals. And they just design these cool structures with these proteins because the calcium oxalate is attracted to those amino acids. The plants build double pointed toothpicks, for example, and double hatted pyramids, little four-sided little triangular things that have each side of it. So like diamonds and these sort of bigger, blockier styloid shapes and little crystal sand, like all these different shapes. You're basically eating tiny bits of pointy, spiky quartz, which is like eating sandpaper, uber fine sandpaper. And that is not good. Mechanically, it causes even tooth wear, let alone what it mechanically can do to a little cell. But also electromagnetically, those crystals have ionic charges on them, and those charges disrupt membrane structure. They cause changes in where the molecules are in the membrane, so it deforms the membrane structure itself. Well, that's really serious. That's messing with God right there, because the membranes are where all of life happens. On these enzymes and proteins and so on are happening on mitochondrial membranes, cell membranes, membranes that all the little things inside a cell are all enveloped in membrane materials. Membranes are how life occurs. If you mess up the basic structure of membranes with all this electromagnetic charge from these little crystals and this acidic ion, you're mucking with things at the cellular level in ways that are a little bit hard to notice on a symptom level. And it takes a while for you to wear down the body's reserves before you're going to get symptoms or notice that your blood or your bones are getting weaker. And, for someone in their 30s, a man in the 30s doesn't get a bone density scan every year. That doesn't happen. You wouldn't even know.
I'd love to delve a little bit deeper into the joint stuff, because I have a feeling that as I lower the oxalate in my diet over the course of time, that my joint health is going to get better. I think it's improved. I do, but it hasn't been that much time. So it's something that I'm going to continue to keep an eye on. But what's going on there with this, as far as inflammation in the joint? Is it inflammation? How should folks think about that in regards to oxalates?
Well, hopefully we'll also get back to that question of time, because time is a really big issue to understand with oxalate. So when you've been eating sweet potatoes day in and day out, overwhelming the blood and making the body hold and stash, basically there's this sort of sequestration or stashing mode where the body's like, oh, gotta get this out of the way, and so you end up having too much of it hanging around in tissues, and it does form these crystals. Now it comes in as an acid ion, but with calcium in the blood and calcium in the tissues and other minerals, it doesn't take that much to turn this acid into a crystal. And these little pairs of calcium oxalate crystal molecules will pair up and start forming a seed crystal. And if it's remember I said it hooks onto proteins, and membranes have proteins in them where reactions occur. Well, the same thing's happening in your body. So when you exercise or walk or talk, you're using jaws, you're using muscles, you're using joints. So every day you have wear and tear in the joints, which means, like everything else, things have a lifespan and they die. So whether it's from overuse or just because it's the end of the lifespan, you will have remnants of dead and dying cells or damage or injured tissue just because you got up today or you worked out today or you typed all day. Somewhere there's a joint that's got dead or dying cells. Those materials can't defend themselves from these little crystals sticking to them, right? So just like the plants can build those crystals by building these architectures with the proteins or the amino acids, the same thing is happening with your cell membranes on cells that aren't vital and happy and healthy and have low inflammation and no infection and no injury. But there are cells in your body with either infection, you're dying or whatever. And that's the kind of material, that's where oxalates start sticking. So you start getting these deposits of crystals building up, and they'll build up in those tissues that can't do anything about it. Eventually the immune system will come in and they'll cloak the crystals that are forming in the body by either spewing out a net, which is the DNA from the cell. It's kind of like Spider-Man throwing a net. The cells will throw out the DNA, and that wraps it up like a fisherman grabbing a bunch of fish. And that provides a bit of a coating around the crystal. So again, the electromagnetic charge that was on the surface is now doused, right? You can hide it under the DNA. Same thing with something called the granuloma. The macrophages that can fight us, can eat crystals, come along and they try to eat these crystals to get rid of them. And it's usually overwhelmingly big or toxic. And so they join together and form what's called a giant cell. And the giant cell tries to eat it. And then it calls in, sends out more cytokines. Hey, there's a problem here. It's been damaging cells. We've got to deal with this problem. And there's all this kind of signaling molecules running around like sirens in the street going, come on, you got to deal with this problem over here, here, here. And so in comes more and more of these immune cells to this area. Of course, it causes inflammation because in order to get the immune cells to that tissue, you have to kind of spread out the gaps in the capillary beds. And so a lot more fluid from the blood starts rushing in with those cells. And so you get kind of swelling and then this immune activity produces heat. So you get warmth and heat and swelling to try to go after crystals, and you start forming potentially, some people, these granulomas where this white cells start piling on and you get this little microscopic tumor around the crystal. And it'll try that for a week or two, and you'll get a gout-like symptom for a couple of weeks. And then the immune cells go, you know what, we're not getting anywhere with this crystal. We should just stop. And so it turns itself off, and then the gout attack ends. But you haven't really gotten rid of the crystal yet. And unfortunately, because you're eating sweet potatoes every day, like I did forever, you're building crystals in your joints. You're building crystals in your bones and marrow and tendons and all over. Wherever blood cells can get to, so can a crystal, which is your whole body. So can an oxalate. And if there's any issues in those tissues, that's places where these crystals may start accumulating. So that's very different for different people. If you type all day, you might end up with carpal tunnel. If you run all the time, or just have an issue with your feet, it might end up in your feet. Hands and feet are very prone, as is the face and jaw. These are areas we use all day long. There's always some wear and tear, and there's a lot of calcium and a lot of connective tissue there. So lots of possibilities for getting crystals hung up in your tissues. So yes, oxalate gout and oxalate bursitis and oxalate arthritis are well known. If you're like from the 1980s and before, that used to always be a thing from like the 1880s or the 1920s until about the 1980s. And then we decided that gout and arthritis was not oxalate related, because there's other crystals that can form in the body. And there's other problems where you create chronic inflammation in joints and you end up with arthritic pain. But today, with the sweet potato and spinach and chia and almond craziness, chances of oxalate driving all this arthritis and pain are really good.
Are you familiar with Malcolm Kendrick's work by chance on heart disease?
On heart disease, probably.
So the way that you explain that process, I had him on the podcast. It sounds very similar. And basically in regards to the endothelium and how that inflammatory process, if there is a rupture, the immune system comes to the rescue, and then you get these speed bumps in the arteries and things like that, which lead to then blockages, and it just goes on and on and on. It sounds remarkably similar, super interesting tie-in there.
Well, the endothelium is the first real victim of oxalates because it's traveling in your bloodstream. So the endothelium is that thin single layer of cells that line your vascular system. And those cells and the muscle cells around them are actually really smart and flexible. And so when you have a rupture or tear, or you get cut or injured or something, they can repair themselves. They can do whatever they need, kind of like stem cell-ish powers to like either get ruined and then rebuild themselves. It's really crazy that you can mess up capillary beds and they can rebuild themselves, but they do. But that superpower, that's sort of what we call plasticity, where a cell can kind of change its cell type and be kind of flexible, makes them extra vulnerable to getting misunderstanding what their real job is meant to be in life. Oxalate does that. Oxalate messes up the cell function enough that it can turn a smooth muscle cell into a bone cell. And the cell starts acting like it's a bone cell and starts calcifying the arteries because you've messed up the reading of the cookbook, in the cookbook being the genetic code, reading the wrong recipe in the wrong place in the body. And it's that sort of plasticity of vascular tissue that makes it so vulnerable to the oxidative damage caused by oxalate in your bloodstream all the time after these meals.
Wow. So we've touched on things like, urinary tract infections, potentially heart disease, joint issues, gout. What are some of the other symptoms that people might be experiencing? Frequent, bladder, bathroom trips. What are some of the other symptoms that people might be experiencing that they could be, attributing to other things that might actually be an oxalate issue?
Well, you didn't mention skin, and skin is another place where the body probably releases all kinds of stuff, including oxalates. It's not just the kidneys and the bladder and the urethra and all that kind of urinary tract stuff is very common, but it doesn't have to be. It's like I didn't have a lot of that stuff in the urinary tract, and I didn't have a lot of skin stuff either. I had deep fatigue and pain and brain fog and just like losing my energy. I mean, just so tired, because it also messes up the energy system in the cells. Oxalate gets on these enzymes that produce ATP and energy in the cells, and the electron transport chain enzymes. It sits right where the right thing is supposed to sit. Oxalate gets in there and blocks it and stops the enzyme from working. So cell energy, you can end up with anemia because your blood cells are not got enough ATP because oxalate is blocking that enzyme, that glycolysis enzyme. And same with in the bone marrow. Oxalate's happening in the bone marrow. You're going to have changes in your blood cell counts. I had really low white counts for years and years. My body just, even though I never got sick and I was tired all the time, and I ended up having anemia because I also had, problems with bleeding. I ended up needing a hysterectomy.
Wow.
Fibrosis. So if you have a fibrotic condition, endometrial fibrosis is one type, but there's all kinds of other fibrotic diseases. And, if you do have collapsing bladder or bladder issues and they go in and try to do a surgical fix, sometimes that stuff just turns into fibrosis. It just becomes a mess because the real problem isn't your bladder. It's that your bladder is poisoned. And now you've got chronic exposure to something that irritates the immune system, both the ions of oxalate, but these little crystals that form in the urine, but also crystals that are hiding around in your body, are all immune cell irritants. So anything that's sort of autoimmune and very inflammatory could potentially be this oxalate creates chronic inflammasome activation, chronically turning your immune system on over and over and over again. So your little gout attack has trouble stopping for very long. It might stop for a while, and then it shows up somewhere else. So it might have been your toe, now it's your shoulder, now it's your hip, now it's your back. So if you have like roving pains, could be a sign too. Digestive problems, of course, if you're eating something that's crystal sand and acid and it's irritating, you're going to have gut problems. So gut problems, urinary tract problems, neurological problems, brain energy, ability to think, memory, mood, anxiety, they could all be neurotoxicity, brain inflammation stuff. So, and then there's that rheumatism, fibromyalgia, chronic weirdnesses like that, muscle knots, poor recovery from exercise. Those are all signs something serious is happening.
Really interesting that you mentioned white cell counts, because when I went to get tested for what I thought was a UTI, I had low white cell counts and cloudy urine. And I'm like, what is going on here?
Classic. You're classic.
Basic, super basic.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's just, I can never get enough of hearing these stories. And what you're describing is sort of textbook oxalate poisoning, in my view.
Okay.
There isn't a textbook on this. I've got a book coming out, but those of us in the health field get no education about the toxicology of plants. We get no education about the low bioavailability. People are out there claiming that spinach is high in calcium. You get no calcium from spinach, none. It's all tied up as calcium oxalate. And it's not only no calcium, it's an anti-calcium molecule that you're eating so much of in the spinach. So it's reducing the calcium in your body. It's giving you 0 plus taking away some. So it's 0 with a go to jail card. It's not good. And yet people all over online say spinach is high in calcium. You need spinach for calcium. No, you can get calcium from mustard greens and turnip greens, but because they're low oxalate vegetables, but you can't get it from spinach. But online bloggers claim it's high, and regular nutrition people with academic backgrounds or working in academia or dietitians or the public health agencies pretend the problems with spinach don't matter. And yet we've known about them for over 100 years and nobody wants to remember what we already know.
Yeah, where I think that this stuff is so powerful and where it's going to be just monumental is in the autoimmune realm. Because we've looked at, I don't know if you're familiar with Rob Wolf. He sort of coined the autoimmune paleo diet. And now things are sort of shifting more towards carnivore as an amazing tool to get all of this under control because, funny enough, those are the foods, animal foods don't contain this stuff. And they contain next to no plant toxins because they are not in fact plants. But I'm not saying that everybody needs to follow a carnivore diet or eliminate every single vegetable from their diet, but if you are experiencing these autoimmune-like conditions, which I had eczema, I've had joint pain, I have some serious autoimmune issues that have run in my family. My aunt passed away from MS, another one from lupus, another aunt has Crohn's, my dad has arthritis. Like it's just everywhere. So,
and those all line up pretty well with oxalate poisoning. MS for sure. Oxalate can demyelinate nerve cells.
Okay.
Crohn's disease seems to show up peripherally in the oxalate literature. I keep seeing that. It's like any kind of serious immunity or, inflammation, chronic inflammation in the gut. You've got to look at plant toxins with oxalate being the point of the spear. That's oxalate. And then you add in lectins that aren't properly cooked and so on. The oxalates are the most important one, not only because it's the most toxic and the most likely problem, but there's no way to get around it with cooking and heat. Like with lectins, you soak your beans and you cook the heck out of them. Although high heat also has problems with plant proteins and all proteins, you can overdo heat treatment, but you're trying to kill the protein, the lectin protein with heat. You also kill the other proteins. So the solution for lectins too is a little bit weak in terms of, well, you can still have all the beans you want. You can't necessarily because both oxalates are high in certain beans, like white beans and black beans. Not so bad in lentils and peas are fine, but you could even on something that's a low oxalate food, because of lectins and other problems, they're still loading up on them and making the centerpiece of your staples of your diet day in and day out has consequences. And we don't really look at that long term. What is this low grade chronic exposure to plant toxins doing to us? And what is the advice of like, oh, you should load up on plants because it's the only thing left that you can eat?
Oh man, that actually brings up a really important issue as far as like, if somebody is experiencing something that they think might be oxalate related, the goal isn't to consume zero oxalate. It's not really possible, but to reduce exposure. So like, how do you recommend that folks take steps towards that if they think that they're dealing with this issue?
Right. So it's important to just learn enough about what are the high oxalate foods. And you can do that pretty directly by going to my website, sallyknorton.com, and then sit back and say, well, what is it? In your case, it was the sweet potatoes, chocolate, and what was the other thing?
I was doing sweet potatoes, dark chocolate, and those were the two major ones. Mm-hmm. I had some other things in the mix that I've had to keep an eye on. Like I've noticed that unripe or just not very ripe strawberries cause an issue for me, and pineapple. So I had some strawberries the other day that were like harder and not very ripe. And I probably like 2 hours later, I had some bladder irritation, and it makes sense as far as those basically like stalagmites or stalactites that you were sort of referencing. It felt like my bladder was irritated from like a needly sort of angle. Does that make sense?
Right. So, but any needles in the plants aren't going straight to your bladder because they're the needles parts, all the crystals in the plant food is going through you and causing sandpaper effects. It's the individual molecules you're absorbing. So what's happening there is probably just related to whatever's in that strawberry. Might be oxalates because strawberries vary a lot in oxalate content. Like it could be anywhere, like a single strawberry is measured as high as like 24 or 5 milligrams of oxalate in a single strawberry, which is insane. versus like really low, maybe 1 or 2, so like they're all over the place. And I think it's because they're a lot of different varieties of strawberries, different degrees of ripeness, but different growing conditions. See, plants make oxalic acid in order to like kill off funguses. So, because it can turn oxalate into hydrogen peroxide and on the leaves and kill. Of course, how does a plant resist fungus? Why is there not fungus growing on all plants all over the place? In rainy, places like Oregon or whatever, where it's cloudy a lot and rainy a lot, plants shouldn't be struggling with fungal diseases, and very few of them do, because they have the power with oxalates and other things to kill the funguses, because oxalate is basically a pesticide. The plants use it as a pesticide to keep the worms and everybody from eating too much of them. But the hydrogen peroxide effect is useful. And when you're a strawberry, because as a strawberry, you're sitting down in the mud, you're like this tall, it's very wet in the spring, and there's a lot of fungal pressure on strawberries. Funguses is like the biggest problem. So if it's a wet spring, your strawberry theoretically could be higher in oxalate. So strawberries are one of those foods I'm like, don't trust a strawberry or a green bean. There's lots of varieties of both. The numbers are all over the map, and you just can't even know, is it a high or low oxalate food? Because it can do either one. So yeah. And then of course there's unripe fruit and unripe in seeds generally. Of course, the strawberries got seeds all around the outside. Seeds are designed to be indigestible and to irritate your gut. They are not easy to digest on purpose. If they were, the plants wouldn't live, because the fruit is to help the seed travel. The fruit encourages us to help those seeds spread and populate the earth. And they're using animals who eat the fruit to do that for them. But the deal is you don't get to take the fruit until the seeds are ready. And so the young fruits are going to be more toxic in oxalate and in other things. So you're right. Ripeness makes a big difference with oxalate content in many foods, like in avocados. There's a whole avocado that's firm has like 45 milligrams of oxalate, which is pretty lot. And a really ripe one has only like 6 or 7 or something like that. So if it's really soft and ready to die, then it's in that case, and same with soybeans, the ripeness has an effect. So there's this because there's these processes the plants are using it for, it's not making it for entertainment, it's making it for very specific reasons. And the reasons change with maturity. So you want to listen to your body, because it doesn't matter if it's oxalate or not. If something is turning on your immune system in your gut, it's going to irritate your bladder, because your immune system generally is on alert again. And if you've got chronic bladder irritation, your bladder lining has been trained to be pissed off and have mast cells and other immune cells there that have a trigger hair. They're like PTSD cell. They're like traumatized. So any kind of generalized chemical signaling in the body that says inflammation will also aggravate your area of sensitivity, like the bladder.
Oh man, I would love to have you back on to talk about like the plant biology, because I think that stuff sort of rings true for people. They're like, oh, I never thought about it that way. That makes sense. The plant is trying to survive too, just like, some animal is that's running around that's going to bite you if you try and kill it, But so would you recommend that folks go from 0 to hero with oxalate? Can there be issues with that?
Oh, yeah.
With oxalate dumping?
Yeah, so we're still trying to get me to tell you what to do about it. Hard to do that. Yeah, so you figure out what foods you're eating, and then you look at like some of the worst ones would be the almonds, the fries, the sweet potatoes, the spinach, the beets, the beet greens, the Swiss chard. Those are like mega ones. Those you could just start like cutting them out, because chances are you have enough tea or chocolate or other things going on that you've still got some oxalate in the diet. And we don't go from this kind of catastrophic high diving board of a high oxalate diet, because people get into thousands of milligrams of oxalate if they're doing smoothies, for example. It's pretty easy to put together 1,000 milligram smoothie, which is 8 times what your body should have in a whole day. One smoothie, 8 times is a lot of a toxin. You're designed to handle some, So you don't want to go from catastrophically high to zero. And some people actually do that because there is this carnivore movement and they've tried everything else. And out of desperation are like, okay, let's just try the meat thing. Because it kind of, if you stop and think about it, it makes sense to simplify and do an elimination diet. This is a kind of a new idea of meat being an elimination diet, although it's an old diet. It's been around for 100 years. They used to routinely put people on meat-only diets as a way to resolve health problems back before pharma became the only way we did medicine. Because in the day, in the 1910s and 20s, you stuck someone out in the sunshine with gallons of milk 3 times a day and said, here, drink all this milk and sit in the sun and relax. And it made people better. And same with meat-only diets. They've been around a long time. But it's considered countercultural now. I don't think it was considered odd 100 years ago. Even though there's been a kind of pro-veggie movement for 400 years, and it was quite the conversation in the early 1800s. And all through the 1800s, there was a big sort of vegan proponents that this was the spiritual way to go. So it's not like veganism and vegetarianism is new, but the fear of meat has been in our culture now for like almost 50 years. They've been trying to tell us that meat is bad for us. So nowadays it sounds so weird to go on a meat-only diet, but people are willing to do it anyway because they're that sick. But I don't recommend you do that in the beginning. It is a useful tool. I eat mostly a meat diet myself. I'm pretty carnivore, but the process is to sort of not unearth these little bits of invisible little chips of oxalate crystals in your body, because that will turn on the inflammation that turns up the immune system, and the immune system tries to dissolve down these crystals with acids and inflammation and enzymes, and it could produce a lot of pain, just the process of digging out these crystals. And it's like surgery without anesthetic. And then the result of the surgery is you're pouring oxalic acid back into the bloodstream and increasing your oxalic acid load in the bloodstream by stopping eating it. You no longer eat your sweet potatoes, and now you have more oxalic acid in your bloodstream because now it's pouring out of tissues. That's called dumping. By Susan Owens came up with that term. It's not an official term, but it's the on the street term that we use. The body is like puking out oxalates that it's been wanting to get rid of for ages, and you never quit with whatever it is you were eating. Like there was always some high oxalate food every day. The body never got a break. In the time I was like, ooh, house cleaning at last. Like if you never dusted your house for 15 years and you finally got somebody to come in and suck the dust out, you'd be all over it. Like, yes, let's clean up this mess. So the body takes that drop from a big change in the intake, tells the body, you got a chance, you can start cleaning up. And you don't want that cleanup process to go fast, because pouring oxalic acid into the bloodstream, even though it's coming from your tissues, is very toxic. It's more toxic on the way out because it involves all that inflammation as well. So there's a whole chemical toxicity that goes with inflammation. And if you keep inflammation high for a long time, that is chronic inflammatory suffering that is quite damaging to the body. You're not supposed to be in a warfare kind of mode all the time. So you don't want to get yourself into that inflammatory releasing state. You don't want high levels of oxalate in your blood, because it ends up being high oxalate levels in your kidneys and can become kidney stones. After you stop eating oxalate, you could create kidney stones. It can become more bladder irritation, more cloudy urine, more stress and fatigue, more bad nights, more waking up, more running to the bathroom, more incontinence. Like, you don't want more of any of those things. That's not the point. There is a slower process, and it has to be slow anyway. It's going to take close to 10 years, depending on the situation in the body, because it's a decades-long process of undoing this toxicity. That's why prevention matters. It doesn't matter if you're having symptoms or not. What matters is, are you eating 8 times or 16 or 20 times more than your body can handle every day? That's going to eventually cause trouble. And you could end up with, like a lot of us, like me and my clients, where it is a 10-year struggle. I'm still releasing oxalate from my body. I'm in my 9th year, low oxalate. I have an ice dye right here, and I've had one here. This last 2 days, I can tell I got changes in the stool. But luckily I don't have the fatigue and the brain fog. Like I've been able to sort of think today. That's good. That's another sign that you may be high in oxalate. If you have days where you're really clumsy, you can't organize your day, you feel very ADD, could be neurotoxicity from oxalate. Get rid of the worst ones. Don't worry about everything else because you probably still got a little tea, a little this and that. Just learn the really worst ones, like the chocolate and all that. And if you're going to continue to eat the chocolate, just you have to really have some control and eat minor amounts. Eventually you want to get down to a truly low oxalate diet, but it can take 2 months or so, 3-6 months to get there. There's no big rush. And, if you still saw sweet potatoes on the menu or had them in the house, 2 or 3 tablespoons of sweet potatoes is about the amount I would need in a meal to prevent you from going into that heavy clearing illness. There is this illness that's created by the clearing. So actually keeping one meal every day where you've got some oxalate stuff going on, which isn't hard to do because oxalate's in a lot of things, will potentially protect you. So the main thing is don't stop making sweet potatoes a staple.
Don't do what I did.
Don't do that. That's what I did. That's what I did for years. And so you and I share that. I wonder if sweet potatoes are especially good at ruining your bone marrow. I don't know. But luckily, I've been able to reverse my arthritis condition that I had really bad during my vegetarian years and reverse my osteopenia and rebirth my ability to think and work. And now I'm starting to be able to work out again. And because I really had to settle for yoga for years, hot yoga, which is great. It's no criticism of it, but being able to do more than that was not really an option because oxalate destroys your energy. You've got crystals in your muscles and tendons. You've got a lot of arthritis and itises and tennis elbow, this and that, and foot, this and whatever, like you try to go to TRX or something like that and you don't last. You're like a dropout from exercise because your connective tissue is messed up. And the connective tissue that's the 10, maybe even 15 years to get back a proper spine, get back proper tendons. It's not going to be quick. So I feel like I'm coming into the phase now at year 9 where I could maybe become like massive old lady.
That's awesome. Now, so slow and steady wins the race as far as reducing oxalate in your diet, liberating it. Now, I think it will be just really quickly helpful for folks as far as I mentioned, I was eating a bunch of yogurt, which actually helped to clear the oxalate. So like calcium citrate, magnesium citrate, maybe. What do you think about that? If people don't tolerate dairy just yet from a skin perspective, how should they approach that?
Yeah, so you really do need a lot of minerals. Oxalate has been wrecking your mineral status, and you need to replace microminerals and these macro minerals, especially calcium and magnesium, are really important. Potassium is really important. It will help with all those arrhythmias and the hypertension and the stress feeling, and lowers the acidity. Oxalate, because you're spilling so many minerals and nutrients and it's causing so much inflammation, both those things create a lot of acidosis in the body. And the citrates help to correct acidosis and help you feel better. You can go juice a lemon if you can tolerate lemons or that citric acid. But taking calcium citrate is really important. We like that sitting in the gut as a magnet to help the gut also excrete oxalate. So when your poor kidneys are stressed out and there's acidity going on, the guts get in the colon will help excrete oxalate, and you've got calcium sitting there, and you've had the citrate to help dissolve crystals, help prevent them from becoming kidney stones. You're protecting your kidney. It's huge. So taking calcium citrate, magnesium citrate, potassium citrate, huge. Microminerals are important. And getting, proper rest and doing those, but those are really critical things. Now, you don't need stone breaker herbs, there's no magic herbs to fix this acidity and this mineral problem. You got to fix the mineral problem with minerals, and it continues. The spilling of the minerals and the potassium continues as long as you're doing ice dyes and dumping and cloudy urine, and we're mineral deficient. And so doing the citrates, so important. And
Right.
Dairy, get back, if you can eat cheese or yogurt or something, find some version of a milk product that works for you. For me, it's a little bit of aged cheese, which of course is convenient and delicious. Raw milk, raw cream, yogurt, kefir, if in whatever amount that seems like it works for you, that's a really good move. And you're describing exactly the problem. Most of us went off dairy sometime in the last 30 years because stuff was not working well for us. And that really escalated the power of oxalate in our diet to get into the bloodstream and just trash our nutrition. Non-dairy eating plus high oxalate eating is really deadly combination.
Yeah, not a cool combo right there. It didn't work out for me, that's for sure. Now, Sally, where can folks find more out about you? You got a book coming up. Where can I direct folks?
Okay, so my website is sallyknorton.com, and there's lots of free information there. You can reach us by, doing the contact email to us through that. There's also an email listserv there. So if you want to get an occasional email about what's going on, then please sign up on the listserv. And you can find me on Instagram as well. So those are the two best places. Come to my website and touch base with us and see me on Instagram.
Amazing. I'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. Thank you so much.
Plus, just so you know, I'll also be issuing a series of testimonial discussions with me on my YouTube channel and maybe other video outlets as well.
Oh, very cool. Okay. I can link to that too.
I'm also going to be issuing a provider course sometime this year.
You're busy woman.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sally, thank you so much. That was awesome. I'm so excited to get this on people's radar. I guess it's like the biggest balance for me is like, I'm a focus on the staples guy, like big rocks kind of thing. But this oxalate thing fucking matters. And so it's about, yeah, I guess I don't want to be alarmist, but at the same time, I want to be like, hey guys, like this is an issue.
People want alarm though. I mean, it's popular. The fear mind, like even like the title of my book is like Toxic Superfoods. The real title of the book that I want on the book is Better, Your Body and Brain on a Low Oxalate Diet. All of us will have a better body and brain on a low oxalate diet, but in order for it to sell, we have to sell fear. So beyond that, what's the real journey here is to recognize oxalate is the biggest rock in the room. If you don't have your oxalate thing, I mean, depends on who your population is. There are people who are so addicted to garbage food and are so addicted to sugar that they just need a whole life revamp. They need to find their soul's purpose and have a real cause that allows them to lift themselves out of that. I mean, that's the soul thing. But the soul will never be reborn when it's toxic.
Yeah, I mean, it's really tough to even think about something like that when you're drowning, right?
Right. But toxicity and deficiency is what makes you unsavable. Like that's the source of all suffering. And oxalate is the source of so much toxicity and deficiency. You'll never really lift a person out if we can't get their body nourished. You can't get an alcoholic to reform if we can't get the B vitamins in them. If you're being poisoned, you're just not going to have the kind of brain that has what it takes to make life happen.
I hope you guys enjoyed that episode with Sally as much as I did. Now, if you're interested in personalized one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can check the link in the description below or head on over to n1fitness.com/coaching. You can also follow me up on Instagram at N1Fitness, as well as on TikTok at the N1Fitness. I am also on YouTube at Marcus Sadu. Thanks so much for listening, guys. I hope that you found this useful, and I will catch you on the next one. See ya.